The breakthrough project became known throughout the world. It was a rare case when humanity forgot about wars, strife, trade wars, and economic rivalry for a while. For the first time, countries, corporations, and scientific centers did not share resources, but extended their hands to each other for a common goal. The goal was to conquer near and then distant space, which previously could only be glimpsed for a moment, horrified by the chaos and one's own insignificance. International agencies, private companies, and the military worked side by side. Everything looked like the beginning of a new era, and perhaps it would have begun, if not for one but. An anomalous formation appeared on the borders of the solar system. It was called by different names: a wormhole, a black hole, a spatial distortion. Scientists were racking their brains trying to determine its nature. The first signals came from automatic long-range observation stations. The scale of the object could not be measured precisely, but one thing was clear. It was in a constant state of activity. The media immediately began to spin the topic, raising panic. Reporters talked about a threat on a planetary scale. The headlines kept changing. The end of all life? The end of the system? Or a window to another world? For several months, the information came in waves. At first, they were frightening. Then, on the contrary, they began to calm down, talking about research. Scientists began to speak out in the media, stating that the threat was not proven, but the prospects were colossal. Interviews were broadcast in which they discussed the possibilities of time travel, hyperspace transitions, and alternative realities. People all over the planet followed the developments with interest. The culmination was a report on Central Television. A special film was shown on the evening news. It was filmed in a neutral tone, with an academic voiceover. It was about the launch of a radio sonde towards the wormhole. The probe was unique. It was equipped with an automatic system for receiving and transmitting signals. The basis of control was artificial intelligence, designed for autonomous operation in extreme conditions. The film showed footage of the mission preparation. People in white overalls, a high-vaulted hangar, a device standing on a demonstration platform. The screen showed explanations of how the probe would tune into the wave, how it would transmit the signal back, and what parameters it should record near the anomaly. The emphasis was on scientific value and safety. It was emphasized that this was about observation, not invasion or contact. The scientific community looked calm and collected. The launch of the device was shown in the recording. Separation of the stages, transition to the required trajectory, approaching the boundaries of the outer orbit. The comments of the specialists sounded confident. The signal from the probe was supposed to reach Earth with a delay, but the calculations said, everything is under control. It was emphasized that the AI is capable of making decisions about turning on or off the modules, reacting to electromagnetic fields, and even adjusting the course. Everything went strictly according to protocol. The probe entered the wormhole's active zone a few weeks later. The first signals arrived at the base and were recorded. They did not carry specific information, only general noise and pulsations. The film explained that this was normal. It could be radiation distortion, or a reflected signal from the gravitational field. The AI continued to work, accumulating data. Communication was maintained, albeit intermittently. The last part of the film showed the image from the probe's onboard camera. Nothing definite, distortions, flashes, darkness. The presenter explained that all this was just the beginning, that beyond the horizon of the wormhole there might be another form of space. The ending of the film was built on optimism. The probe was the first step. There would be others. Project Breakthrough had just begun. The presenter was in the Central Television studio where the live broadcast was taking place. He was sitting at a table, illuminated by the cold light of the spotlights, and staring at the camera without taking his eyes off it. The atmosphere was tense, the control room was completely silent, the director waved his hand, the signal went on air. The presenter slowly turned to the monitor where the commander of the aerospace forces appeared on the video link. The voice in the earphone confirmed permission. The presenter nodded slightly and after a short pause, hesitantly but loudly enough, said, Probe. Tantalus, can you hear me? He leaned forward slightly, trying to look calm, although his voice trembled. For a minute, there was no sound in the studio. Everyone was looking at the screens where the communication channel with the probe was displayed. The light strip at the bottom of the screen hung, as if the system was waiting for a response. At that moment, a clear, calm voice was heard. It was the artificial intelligence installed on board the Tantalus. It greeted the studio and everyone present. Politely and without pathos, it said, "Good afternoon. Nice to hear from you. How are you feeling?" The presenter, hearing this answer, did not immediately believe it. He exchanged glances with the director and, noticing the approving gesture, smiled broadly. A slight animation was also heard in the studio. Someone exhaled, someone even laughed briefly. The AI's voice sounded humanly calm, without cold detachment. This made an impression. The presenter, having cheered up, spoke again. "Where are you? What do your sensors see? Can you describe the situation?" The answer came almost immediately, with a slight delay. The AI reported that it could not yet accurately estimate the distance from the current position to Earth. It noted that the device was in a system that included a luminary and 3 planets moving in stable orbits. The sensors recorded the presence of a gravitational center and clearly defined trajectories. The visibility of objects remained high. The image was transmitted in good quality. Information was collected but required additional processing. The artificial intelligence said that it would take time to obtain accurate data. The studio listened closely to every word. Visualizations based on preliminary telemetry data appeared on large screens. People in the room stared at the graphs. The presenter fell silent, giving the AI a chance to continue. A minute later, the signal came alive again. The Tantalus AI reported that the time needed for calculations was 2,054 hours. Its voice remained the same, smooth, businesslike, without tension. This figure caused an immediate reaction. A heavy silence hung in the studio. Someone chuckled, someone clicked their tongue. The presenter visibly tensed up but quickly pulled himself together. He looked at the camera and, clutching the tablet in his hands, prepared to end the broadcast. The live broadcast was coming to an end. The operator pointed to the timer. A few seconds left. The presenter's voice sounded clear and without trembling. "The breakthrough has been made. All that remains for humanity is to wait. Wait and hope for possible contact with an extraterrestrial civilization." He paused, then added, "Until we meet again." The camera began to smoothly move away. The lights in the studio dimmed. The project's signature intro appeared on the screen. The broadcast ended, but the discussion continued behind the scenes. Technical specialists immediately began analyzing the information they had received. Scientific consultants whispered, forming their first hypotheses. The host took off his microphone and rubbed his face tiredly. Phones rang off camera. The editors were waiting for feedback from viewers. The internet was already starting to hum. But the main thing was that Tantal had responded. The breakthrough project had done something that no one had ever done before. The first voice contact with a device outside the solar system had been established, although without details, coordinates, or specifics. The main thing was that the breakthrough beyond the solar system had taken place. Now, all that was left was to wait. 2,054 hours, almost 3 months. That's how long it would take for the artificial intelligence to collect and process all the data. The world was no longer the same. The first words from the other side had been heard, and there was no threat in them. For now. The commander of the aerospace forces sat at a massive table in a concrete hall lined with sound-absorbing panels. His face remained stony, despite the bravura reports that were flying around the news. He did not smile, did not comment, simply kept his hands on the table, not taking his eyes off those gathered. In front of him in the chairs sat the heads of the leading departments of the space program. Among them were the director of the Federal Space Agency and an invited representative of the private company Syntec Cybernetic. The atmosphere was tense. The conversation was not for the sake of protocol. They were waiting for decisions, not reports. The commander turned to the representative of Syntec first. His voice was dry, without a hint of politeness. "What about your developments? Why are you dragging your feet?" The director of Syntech Cybernetic, a man of about 50 with gray hair at the temples, wearing a black jacket and a platinum badge on his lapel, rose from his seat. His movements were confident, but there was tension in his voice. He cleared his throat slightly and began. "I already explained it to you. Singularity is not assembling a machine. We cannot train neural networks at the snap of a finger, especially in conditions of uncertainty. We need data. We get it, but not quickly." The commander turned purple, but outwardly maintained his composure. He clenched his fist, banged it on the table, and said sharply, "How many units are ready now?" Without any extra slop about singularity, motherfucker. The head of Syntech did not argue. He silently took a thick gray cover out of the folder, put it on the table in front of him, and unfolded it. "1," he said, but polished to the core. "Full self-diagnostics, adaptive protocols, autonomous combat mode if needed. We squeezed everything out of it. It's better than any prototype." Someone from the technical team sitting closer to the monitor whistled. "Yes," he said. "It's too early to fully equip the crew, and there's already pressure from above." The commander turned his head and stared at the speaker, as if drilling him with a gaze. "Is your group ready?" he asked. The employee nodded firmly without looking away. "Yes, 4 people, volunteers, all astronauts with perfect service records, not tourists, not greenhorns. Worked in the stratosphere, in orbit. 3 of them had undergone training in a vacuum." The commander nodded approvingly and pointed a finger at the speaker. Then he slowly turned to the head of Syntech Cybernetic and looked meaningfully. He didn't say a word, but it was clear. This is how you should work. No whining, no excuses. You could tell right away. They were his people. Then he spoke again, not as harshly but still harshly. "It's decided. The crew is 4 people. We'll add this miracle of yours to them, the cybernetic organism. Let it go in a bundle. We'll test it in combat conditions. After this," the commander began to speak more confidentially, as if addressing those who were already in the know. "Of course, we cooperate with the highbrows from NASA. The papers have been signed, the flags have been hung. But I consider this meeting closed. An association is an association, and states are states." He looked at the door, which was tightly closed. No one moved. Everyone waited for him to continue. "According to the data we receive from the orbital stations," the commander continued, "neither the Americans nor the Europeans have any idea what the hell this wormhole is. The nature of the object is unknown. The structure is unstable. It is shrinking. Very slowly, but it is a fact. If this continues, the window may slam shut. And we don't know when. And we don't know if those who go there will return." He paused, looking at the table, then looked up and added, "This is being kept from the public. No one should know. No one needs panic. We must be in time. We have little time, and there is no more room for error." Alexei's eyes flew open. His entire body shook from short electrical impulses as if he was being driven through a saturated field. He breathed heavily, remembering fragments of a dream. He had just seen his wife, the way he wanted to remember her. Soft, bright, alive. And suddenly, darkness. A sharp pop in his ears, as if from a depressurization, and before his eyes, the plastic of the outer shutter of the stasis chamber. A long hissing sound was heard. The hermetic seal slid to the side with a grinding sound. The panel smoothly slid down, revealing the light and cold of the sterile cabin. Alexei jumped up, tearing the thin medical control tapes from his chest and arms. The skin under the Velcro itched, his face twisted from lack of sleep and abrupt awakening. A buzzer sounded in his ears, annoying with a metallic echo. It blocked out everything. Alexei screamed into nowhere, "Get up already, get up! Stop yelling!" As if his mother had called him to school 40 years ago. He cursed through his teeth, rubbed his face, and stood on the cold floor. The capsule slowly sucked in the remaining gas and prepared for the system regeneration cycle. 3 other capsules stood nearby. Their panels also began to move. Synchronously, with millisecond precision, the flaps moved to the side. The light fell on the astronauts' faces. The first was Olaf Grund, tall, bald, with a tattoo on his neck and a greasy northern accent. A combat pilot with 24 missions in orbit, he served in the Norwegian Air Force, then went into the private navy. The second was Takanawa Hiroshi, a quiet Japanese man of about 40, with a short haircut and a look that was always calculating something. An astrophysics engineer, he had been trained by NASA and had participated in the Vesta 9 project, which studied supernovae. The third was Susan Winter, an American with short red hair, stocky build, a former test pilot who worked for Space Analytics. Everyone yawned, stretched, winced from the harsh light. The body was in no hurry to turn on after suspended animation. Takanawa shuddered, rubbed his shoulders, and muttered, "Your mother. I want barley coffee. Right now." He looked around as if the coffee was somewhere in the corner. And then from the wall, almost silently, a cyber began to approach. Its titanium ceramic body was cast in a faded gray. Its movements were smooth, like a cat's. But there was an inhuman precision in them. Silence hung in the cabin for a second. Susan turned around sharply, squinting, and almost cursed out loud. "Rudolph, you bastard, you can't sneak up on me like that." She slapped her hand over her heart and sat on the edge of the capsule, breathing heavily. Cyber stopped at her bed, bowed his head slightly, and took a step back as if apologizing. His face was a flexible mask surface, repeating his facial expressions down to the muscle contraction. His smile was human, if a little unnatural, too symmetrical, too smooth. "Sorry, Susan," he said. "My main program doesn't include the noise function, but I can tap my heel on the floor if I want." Alexei snorted. "And with humor. That's our lucky day." Takanawa looked at Rudolph with undisguised skepticism. He looked almost human, but only from a distance. Up close it was clear. His fingers were mechanical, his joints were articulated, servo motors rolled under a thin shell. His face was just a mask. Too perfect. Everything about him betrayed the machine, despite the efforts of the engineers. Only his eyes were too attentive. Olaf came closer and snapped his fingers in front of the cyber's face. "You're such a devil," he said. "If I woke up with a hangover, you'd give me a heart attack." Rudolph bowed slightly. "I have first aid supplies, including defibrillation and intravenous nutrition." Olaf laughed. "No, brother. You'd better serve me coffee than shock me." Everyone relaxed a little. Alexei chuckled but didn't look Rudolph in the eye. He stepped to the locker, pulled out his overalls, and began to dress. His body was gradually returning to normal. There was a ringing in his ears, but his vision had already stabilized. "How long were we in stasis?" he asked. "Who's counting?" Takanawa was already looking at the monitor, running his eyes over the data. According to the timestamp, 109 days. 3 days until we enter the hole zone. Alexei nodded. "Then stop lying around. We have work to do." 5 minutes after waking up, everyone was already sitting at their places. The suits were zipped up, the panels were turned on, the interfaces were awake, the screens came to life. A light hum went through the ship. The stabilizers were adjusting the position of the hull. Takanawa, clutching the handrail, took a sip from a metal mug and exhaled loudly. "So what's up, navigator?" he asked Susan, narrowing his eyes slightly. She turned to him, opening her mouth to answer, but was interrupted by Rudolph's voice. He spoke clearly, with the same pathos that infuriated living people. "We entered the wormhole about 4 weeks ago." Everyone turned to him, although they knew perfectly well where the voice was coming from. Rudolph stood motionless as if he had been built into the floor, and only his head slowly turned towards the carriage. "The intra-system space engines are active now," he continued. "We are approaching a planet located in the habitable sector of the star Z3412. The voice was emotionless, but there was an insistent politeness in it. Olaf leaned back in his chair, grunted, and asked, "That a name has already been assigned?" Rudolf nodded. "Approved within the framework of the Autonomous Protocol for Categorization of Objects. The name is systemic, within the limits of acceptable standards." Susan rolled her eyes, crossed her arms, and said through gritted teeth, "I could report it myself." She abruptly switched on the panel and began scrolling through the telemetry, pointedly ignoring the cyber. Alexei did not interfere. He looked out the porthole. Beyond the thick protective plate, space was black. But there, somewhere in the distance, a faint glow was already visible. A bluish star hung motionless like a light bulb in a vacuum. Around it were 3 planets, visible in the reflected spectrum. Everything matched the data. There was no need to manually compile reports on board the Tantalus. Everything that the eyes and sensors saw was processed by Rudolf. He recorded, analyzed, compared. He even converted visual images into data and recorded them in the drive. Alexei turned his gaze to the cyber, frowned, and asked, "Are you broadcasting?" Rudolf turned his head and answered without pause, "The anomaly has stopped transmitting signals. From now on, I am working in the mode of accumulation and consolidation of information." Olaf scratched his chin, looked at the system map, and squinted. "Maybe we should hang in orbit then. Listen, feel it for radio signals." There was no order to land after all. Alexei nodded. "That's right. It's an observation mission." Takanawa, who had been silently watching the biocycles, added briefly, "It's easier to stabilize in orbit, and safer." The ship began to turn slowly. The course deviated 5 degrees from its previous one to enter the ecliptic of the nearest planet. The star Z3412 shone with a pale, almost icy light, but the radiation level was within normal limits. The atmospheric composition of the planet had not yet been calculated. The data was just coming in. Susan turned on the passive probing mode and said, "We can start scanning in 15 minutes. If there's anything alive and breathing, we'll find it." Takanawa checked the electromagnetic profiles and shook his head. "Silence for now. Neither coded nor chaotic. The planet is empty, or pretending to be." Alexei leaned back in his chair, feeling his body begin to obey. "The main thing is not to rush. We've already had enough. Now we just have to watch." A tense silence fell around again. Rudolf stood in the corner, not moving, but it was clear that he heard everything. The next 12 hours passed in a routine. No incidents, no unexpected commands. The systems worked stably. The standard mode was maintained on board. Sensors were checked every 2 hours. Reports were not required. Everything went according to protocol. The team followed the diet and sleep schedule, as prescribed in the instructions. Each of them took turns replacing the other at the panel, monitoring the indicators, making notes. The rest of the time they tried to sleep. Then another 12 hours passed. Everything was the same watch, the same routine. But one thing was starting to make them wary. Everyone was getting sleepy. Not like after a hard shift or overload. There was something different here. Their eyes were closing even after sleep. Their bodies seemed to be pulled toward the floor. They felt it, but no one could describe it clearly. The condition was strange, viscous. Everyone felt it in their own way, but the essence remained the same. Fatigue was growing for no reason. Rudolf, despite the constant data collection, could not comment on this. His answer was the same. Biological parameters are within normal limits. No deviations were registered. He did not express alarm, did not try to find the cause. He simply recorded the current state and continued observation. The crew was irritated by this, but arguing with the cyber was useless. He carried out the task without including emotions. He answered attempts to engage him in dialogue in monosyllables informally. Takanawa began drinking coffee more often. He would run the heating module every half hour, sometimes more often. He held onto his mug like a life preserver. Each sip was a desperate attempt to clear his head of the fog. Olaf and Susan began taking stimulants. They made no secret of it, swallowing capsules right at the control panel. First one, Then two. Olaf winced. Susan simply pressed her lips together. There was no discussion about it. Everyone understood that they couldn't stand it any other way. Alexei was asleep at the time. He went into the compartment, lay down in the stasis bed without activating the capsule, and fell asleep without undressing. He was not disturbed. They decided that he would take over the watch later. The room was dark. The silence was broken only by the faint hum of the ventilation. Alexei lay motionless, as if he had passed out. He dreamed of something blurry, like an old video that was losing focus. He did not wake up even when someone passed by or the device's timer went off. When he finally woke up, his head was ringing. He sat up, slowly leaned on his elbows, his eyes widened. And the next second they widened in horror. His face turned pale, his breathing quickened. He didn't immediately understand where he was. Everything seemed alien, as if he had ended up in another compartment or another time. The light was dim, murky. The panels displayed static lines as if frozen. He looked to the side and realized that something was wrong. His whole body tensed. Alexei slowly stood up, not taking his eyes off the observation panel. He stepped toward the porthole, as if hoping to find an answer behind the glass. But there was no answer there. Only silence. He turned away, pressed himself against the bulkhead. His heart was pounding in his chest like a hammer. He couldn't believe his eyes, but he couldn't look away either. Fear filled his mind like gas. Everything that was happening was starting to resemble delirium, but it was more real than any dreams. Olaf, Susan, and Takanawa remained in their places, or rather, Takanawa was no longer sitting. He was lying by the chair, and only a thin, curved hand with straightened fingers peeked out from the dense cocoon. Alexei, having barely seen him, froze. His heart thudded. He slowly moved forward, looking around. A dim light streamed along the walls, and everything seemed strangely slow. He ran up to the body and began to tear the cocoon with his hands. The material was viscous, rough, like old cobwebs or thin, loose plastic. It stretched, but at the same time tore without effort. Alexei was choking from the strain. He screamed, "Rudolph? Rudolph! Help me!" The voice broke into a hoarse voice. Somewhere in the depths of the compartment, footsteps were heard, precise, measured. Cyber approached silently and without a word began to remove the threads, working with his fingers like a surgeon. The web was falling in flakes. Takanawa's face was revealed beneath it. His skin had taken on a greenish tint, his eyes were closed. Alexei, shaking, shook him by the shoulder, tried to wake him up, call his name, slapped his cheek. No reaction. Then he turned to Rudolph, his gaze filled with panic. Is he alive?" Cyber did not look away and calmly replied, "Takanawa is dead." Alexei recoiled. He didn't immediately understand what he had heard. "How?" he muttered. "What the hell happened?" He didn't wait for an explanation. He jumped up and ran towards the storage room. There, behind the bulkhead, was a module with weapons and emergency defense equipment. But when he reached the airlock, his legs buckled. The panel was open. The protective curtains were down. The entire room was covered in the same disgusting, stuck-together web. It covered the panels, the floor, even the automatic fasteners. Alexei cursed, raised his hand to the control panel, but the sensors weren't working. Rudolph's voice came from behind. He didn't come closer, he just activated the display on the wall. The internal surveillance recording appeared. Alexei slowly turned and approached. The picture went on without sound. He watched as 4 spider-like creatures crept into one of the compartments. Black, elongated with broken legs and tiny heads, they moved sharply and silently. Alexei instinctively covered his mouth with his hand in fear. He watched the creatures crawl around the cabin. But what struck him most was that no one was reacting. Olaf, Susan, and Takanawa were still sitting at their panels, staring at their screens. They were just working. As if nothing was happening. Creature after creature approached them, covered their bodies with sticky thread, tightened the cocoon, and they sat there, and did not move. Their faces remained calm. No panic, no screams, no attempts to resist. Alexei took a step back. How can this be? This is nonsense. Nonsense. He shook his head, unable to process what was happening, and then a sharp, sweetish smell hit his nose. It came suddenly, as if someone had spilled a bottle of perfume. Alexei froze, then blinked. The smell penetrated deep into his nostrils, leaving a lingering aftertaste. A wave of warmth went through his body, his muscles relaxed. Panic retreated as if someone had pressed an internal switch. His eyes were clouded. He could barely keep his balance. The world began to blur. The edges of the cabin dissolved. It began to seem that everything was fine. The anxiety was gone. Everything was going as it should. He slowly turned around and saw those same creatures crawling along the walls again. They moved calmly, in no hurry. 2 of them were pulling the cocoons with the bodies of Olaf and Susan, pulling them into the shadows. The 3rd stopped at Takanawa's body and began to cover it with web again. Rudolf stood nearby. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched. Alexei, sliding down the wall, whispered, "Why aren't you doing anything?" Cyber didn't answer. He just looked. One of the spider-like creatures stopped. Its body trembled with internal tension as if a tight mechanism were turning under the woolly, shaggy plates. It turned and stared at Alexei. A multitude of eyes, black, wet, devoid of emotion, stared at him without blinking. The seconds dragged on viscous, like oil on glass. Then the creature moved. It approached him slowly and extended a furry front paw. It touched Alexei's shoulder, ran it along his body, along his neck, as if checking to see if he was alive. Alexei didn't react. He didn't feel fear. He didn't feel anything. His mind had long since left the ship. He was far away, at home, among the blossoming apple trees, in a sunlit plot. He inhaled the scent of a spring garden, heard bees and the splash of water. The air was warm, smelled of fresh grass. He smiled, looking at the sky, and when the spider began to wrap his body in a cocoon, he didn't even move. Thin whitish threads lay on his skin, merging with it. The spider worked carefully, with the precision of a craftsman. Behind him, Rudolf turned on the internal communication channel. The system recorded the resumption of transmission of the signal to Earth. The channel was unstable, but the data passed through. Rudolf transmitted a report. During the flight, the ship was penetrated through the cargo lock. His voice was even. He did not evaluate, did not explain. He simply stated. In the same message he wrote, "A few hundred kilometers from the ship, the movement of plasma clots with a metallized core was detected. The source is the 2nd planet of the system, an inhabited sector." The message went on the air, was recorded in the transmission buffer. The signal weakened but remained operational. A new block of data followed. Observation continues. One of the crew members, Alexei, is alive. Rudolf stood motionless, his artificial face remained emotionless. One of the spiders, the one watching Alexei, suddenly turned its head. It tore itself away from the cocoon and walked sideways. It stopped 2 steps away from Rudolf. It looked at him for a long time, assessing him. Its eyes did not blink, but there was some kind of cold consciousness in them, from which something ancient and alien emanated. It seemed that it was trying to understand who was in front of it. A machine, an enemy, food. But after a few seconds, the creature turned around and crawled into the next compartment, dissolving into the semi-darkness. Alexei didn't see it. He continued to live inside his dream. He heard the tree branches swaying, his wife laughing as she picked up apples from the ground. He didn't feel the cocoon. Didn't feel that his body was no longer obeying. He didn't know that his central nervous system was suppressed. Completely. The insectoid life form had secreted neuroinhibitors into his brain. His blood was saturated with hormonal compounds that caused a lasting euphoria. He was happy. Causelessly, irrevocably, deeply. He felt joy even when one of the creatures tore his thigh, pulling the leg out entirely with a crunch of the joint. dark, viscous blood flowed from the tear. The spider was in no hurry. It injected a secretion into the wound, and the tissue began to hiss, corroded as if by acid. The muscles fell apart into fibers. The creature bent down, sucking in some of the destroyed flesh through a thin, needle-like proboscis. Rudolph stood motionless. His eyes glowed a dull blue. He did not interfere. He had not been ordered to interfere. He was unmoved by suffering or blood. There was no humanity in him. He recorded parameters: pulse, blood pressure, the extent of damage. For him, Alexei was alive. As long as the brain gave signals, everything that happened was recorded. There was a mission, there was data, and the rest, it did not matter. The signal was received on Earth a year later. It took almost 2 months to interpret it. Every word, every encrypted fragment, every unit of data was processed as if it held the key to humanity's very existence. When the head of the VKS studied the results, he was shocked. This was not just information, it was a catastrophe. He screamed at the Syntax cybernetic employee, blaming him for their cyber's inaction. The voice was so furious that it seemed ready to tear him apart. Why didn't he intervene? Why didn't they stop this? The head of the VKS growled. The employee from Syntech, without any visible panic, calmly answered, "There may have been a glitch. Cyber may not have responded to the incident due to built-in violence inhibitors. Protocols may have limited its actions." The head of the VKS grabbed his head, trying not to lose his composure, but was already beginning to lose patience. "Is this a glitch? That's all you can say? We've screwed up the team. Years of preparation, billions of dollars." He turned to his deputy and, clenching his teeth, asked a question that seemed logical. "What about our orbital defense stations? Can we send a few modules into the wormhole and grind everything there into dust?" The deputy shook his head. "Orbital modules are not designed to transit through such conditions. The wormhole is at least 80% closed. We cannot go there without losing everything." The head of the VKS cursed, slamming his fist on the table. Everything was collapsing. He saw his ambitions and dreams of interstellar expansion turn to dust. One of the specialists, standing in the corner, said bitterly, "Space is a jungle. We were the first to send word about ourselves, and we ran into aggression. There was no accident or luck in what happened. We became a target." The head of the VKS closed his eyes, rubbed his temples, and, judging by the expression on his face, was looking for some kind of way out. He realized that no, they couldn't handle this. This was more than just a threat. This was war. He took a deep breath and with even greater irritation gave the order. "Prepare a version for the media about the return of the astronauts. We will do a studio shoot. We will modulate everything as needed. Let the world see. Let them believe." He turned to the others and added with hatred, "In general, why should I teach you? This isn't the first time you fed people crap." At that moment, in complete silence, something terrifying was happening in Rudolph's compartment. An artificial intelligence programmed with strict norms and rules was faced with a dilemma that had no solution. It saw everything that was happening. It observed living beings, people, with their thoughts and feelings, and then arachnids. And it could not do anything. The internal system embedded in its neural network stood on defense, a ban on attacking thinking beings. This ban was like a wall that could not be broken through. The things that crawled through the ship were thinking. Every one of the spiders was intelligent. They weren't just acting on instinct, they weren't just looking for food. Their actions, their gaze, their movements, all of it suggested that they were in control. Rudolph knew that their thoughts were organized. He sensed their intelligence, their consciousness, something that separated them from mere animals. He couldn't understand it. He couldn't accept that this life form, alien to him, was as intelligent as the people in the cocoons behind the panels. But the worst thing was different. He couldn't obey his own program, and the insectoid creatures knew it. They felt it. And at that moment, when he tried to bypass the ban again, His system froze, as did his own thoughts. He was shackled like a corpse that had survived. The external reality was much more terrible than he could imagine, and he, being a machine, was completely powerless against it.